In this video, we're going to talk about the main functionality and GUI design. We're going to be using a sample program that I've created to walk through the elements of the project process. First of all, remember GUI, that's our graphic user interface. What we want to do is figure out how will the user interact with the project. What constraints are you going to place on interactivity? And well, in this example, I'll talk about that and explain why you might want to place some constraints, and then what design elements are needed. And again, those are going to flow from the constraints you're going to place and your goals in terms of that interactivity. And then finally, you want to figure out the inputs and the outputs that you're going to need to have in order to achieve those goals. In this case, we're going to use a sample project that is going to be a simple invaders game. So for the interactivity in this, the user is going to have a ship that they will be able to drag across the screen to block some kind of an alien attack. The constraints, the ship will be able to move horizontally but not vertically. And I'll explain why I decided to do it that way. I mean, basically, it just makes it a little bit simpler in the coding. You could do something more complex than that. You know, if you were to do something that had a similar collision type functionality, you definitely could have it moving in all directions. But just to give you an example and to show you why constraints may be important and, you know, potentially can even make your coding task a little bit simpler, I thought this would be a good example. So those are going to be our the main interactivity and constraints for the moment, and it's going to get more complicated as we start to program, but that's good enough to get us started. Then in terms of our design elements, we want to have something to protect, and I'm going to use a city because I know that I can have some real simple sort of building icons that I can use for a city. We want a sky where the projectiles are going to come from. We want the ship. We need to design a ship that can be dragged horizontally. And then for our inputs and outputs, we want that user action of click and drag, right, to drag the ship along. And we want to know as an output, we want to know the horizontal location of the ship, right? We're going to need to know that if we want to tell if the ship has stopped the projectile or if it's gone through to hit the city. So that's some information that we need. And again, this will get a little bit more complex as we start to program, but we know for sure that those are some things we need right now. With that in mind, that sets the table for us. Let's go take a look at the start of this program. Okay, so here's what it's looking like so far. We have a sky. Well, we have a gameplay area, and it looks like a night sky. We have a ship, and the ship, as you can see, is doing the clicking and dragging thing. We have a start button, a reset button. When you hit the start button, we do populate this with a nice little city that's on, it looks like a little horizon, and then it's got some buildings. And if you reset, you'll notice that the city is populated randomly, both in terms of the colors of the buildings and the types of buildings that are used. So that's what we have so far. Oh, and also just to show you how the CSS is working, as you can see, we have a varied width that's working right now on a percentage of the total screen width in order to size the size of the game field. In our HTML, pretty easy. We have, you know, very simple, just areas defined. And remember, we want to start with our tools. So I'm using Font Awesome, and that's how I'm creating the little buildings. Those are all just Font Awesome icons. And again, refer to the Module 4 videos to see how we incorporate those. You know, we can incorporate those with script. I've got jQuery, and I also have the jQuery UI. And again, check out the last module if you want to know more about using the jQuery UI. And that's where we're getting this draggable functionality. Okay. And then we have a few different areas, and you can see them here in our code. And let me pull up the inspector view to reinforce this. So in our body, obviously that's our header. And then we have our game area. And so this is the entire game area. And then it has 3 areas within that. The sky container, which is where the sky, whatever we do with the sky, is going to go. The defender location. So that's our where our ship can fly, essentially. And you know, it's got a height there in order to give some leniency in terms of where the user can click and drag, and also to keep the ship an appropriate height above the buildings, right? We don't want it sticking like right on the tops of the buildings. We want it to be sort of up in the sky. And I'll show you in CSS in a second how I did that. And then the city container, of course, which is where the little buildings go. And as you can see, this is actually in a set of blocks. So each building is in its own block. And we can talk about why that might be a good idea to code in that way. And it has, as you can see, it's got some different color codes for the city, and the city is created dynamically. So when we reset, you can see that the city container starts empty. And when you hit play, then it is populated with the buildings, right? So this is just like in module 4 where we talked about writing code dynamically. Okay, let's take a look for just a second at the CSS. So this is the background to create the starry sky. And that's just one of the examples from the CSS patterns generator that we talked about in previous classes, and that you've probably already been using in projects. So this is just one that comes out like a starry sky. So that's some borrowed code. Then notice that the sky container and the city container are both set up as grids with a column template of 10 columns, so 10% for each of the columns, right? So both of those are set that way. And then we have the defend container, and this is how we get it to move only horizontally and not vertically, because normally you'd be able to, I'll show you in a second, you'd be able to move that within this 80 pixels. But I've created the defender itself, the ship, with a height of 80 pixels. So it fits the exact height of the container, and therefore it only moves horizontally and not vertically, right? And again, I'll show you why this is an advantage probably in the next video when we get into the collision detection. Okay, now all of the sky blocks and the city blocks are set to margin auto, which means everything happens in the center of those blocks. And again, that's just going to help simplify the targeting for us. And then to create that horizon effect with the sort of grass that fades into the sky, that is just a linear gradient that goes from black to a sort of default green. And then we do have some colors, and you can imagine we're randomly choosing among those colors. And then this is just our button CSS for the hover effect and the basic look of those buttons. So that's what's going on in the CSS. Nothing that should be unusual or unknown to you. But if you can make it look pretty nice if you're just careful about it and make some good choices about the look of it. And so you do want it to look as nice as possible as you're designing the GUI for this final project. Okay, now for the exciting part, let's get into the code. There's a little array here of buildings, and this is very much like what I did in module 4, where I've got some font awesome codes and then some building names that go along with them. So I'm not going to get into that in a ton of detail. Then notice we have the city blocks, and for the city blocks, I'm going to create an object of city blocks that has a series of arrays in it that correspond to different properties of those city blocks that I want to keep track of. So I know I'm going to want to have the ID. I'm going to need to target that ID to do different things depending on whether it's hit or not, and that sort of thing. I want to know what kind of building, because I have in my mind, and I haven't enacted this yet in the code at all, but I have in my mind that depending on which building, it's going to be worth more or less points. So if it explodes, it's going to subtract points. If you successfully defend a laser from hitting it, it'll add points. And there'll be different point values depending on whether you're saving a school or a hospital or whatever, right? So I want to know the building type, and I'm going to keep that, and I want to know that for each block. Then I want to know the X coordinate, the minimum X coordinate, maximum X coordinate, and those are going to correspond actually to left and right, and I'll talk about that in a subsequent video. And then finally, something for the block state, which will be like normal or exploded or something. I'm not sure exactly what terminology, but I know for sure I want to be able to track whether or not the block has been hit before, because that's going to make a difference. If it's already been hit, I don't want you to be losing the points for the building because the building's not there anymore. So it'll make a difference in the scoring. And again, that's down the road. We'll talk about that later. But you want to think about those things as you're planning out your data structures in the beginning. And we can always add to this data structure, of course, but the more you can plan that out ahead of time, the better that's going to be. Okay, then in terms of some of the things for the game board, I want to know the horizontal location of the defender. So where is that line on the screen where the defender is floating? I want to know where the skyline is, that is where the buildings are. And then I have some notion in here that I want to be able to change the difficulty. So I'm kind of planning for that. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to cope with that yet, but I'm just doing a little bit of planning ahead of time. Okay, and then we just have our simple, always working functions that are looking to detect behaviors on the page. Obviously, the start just goes and calls the start game function. The reset just reloads the page. And then we have this one, remember, this is from the UI, the draggable. So that's the jQuery UI function or method of draggable that allows this functionality. And notice the containment is parent. So because the ship is living inside of this div called defender contain, it restricts it to there. So that gives us the nice behavior where it doesn't go past the left and right boundary of defender contain. All right, easy little randomizer. We know we're going to need that. So I just made that right up front. And then let's go look. So the first thing it's looking for is start game. And just to show you here, all it's doing right now is loading the city and initializing the locations. So if you go to load city, you see what it's doing here is I'm setting a little variable for 10 blocks. That's going to be how many of the little individual grid blocks it's going to be. Using that as a variable because I know eventually I might want to be able to infer that value instead of use it as a literal. We're going to have a variable called which building and some temp code, a div, and then a color code. And then there's going to be an X dimension here somewhere. So I'm just going from 0 to the number of blocks. So that's 10 in this case. I'm going to create the code and then I'm going to append it into the all city container here, right? That's down. Remember, there was that div down at the bottom of the screen. And then I'm just figuring out the X dimensions of the city blocks. So remember, we wanted our X min and our X max. And there's this nice function called get bounding client rectangle. That's what the rect is there. That's a JavaScript code. So that's the way that I'm getting that left and right value. And I'll talk about this more at length in the collision detection one. But for the moment, just know that I'm tracking the left and right side of the city blocks for the moment. And then we're just figuring out which type of building we're going to put in there. We're adding that to the code. So putting that in the building code. Then I'm pushing various information into my city blocks array. So you remember that array has got all those different properties. So I'm figuring out the building type, the block ID, all the things that I want to track, right? We already did the X min and the X max. So all those things that I want to track, I'm putting into there. And then I'm actually writing that city block to the page. So that's what this is doing. It's basically doing all the work of figuring out the buildings and their color and where they're going to go. And then it's just populating them on the page. That's what load city does. And then initialize locations is just figuring out the dimensions of the game board. It's figuring out again, using this get bounding client rectangle one, but using it on all city, put defender, all sky. So those 3 different layers, it's figuring out exactly what those Y boundaries are, and then putting that into our global variable of game board, right? So that we know what the dimensions of it are. So this is just figuring out the Y dimensions, where the different Y values are, those horizontal benchmarks are for the game board. So that's all we're doing right now. We just have loaded this in. The ship itself is just made out of a font awesome icon of it's actually like a hand that's held out, and then horizontal flipped, same icon, and 2 of those stuck together. That's all I did to make the ship. I thought it was kind of funny to use the hands to sort of stop the lasers, so I thought that would be fun. So that just gives you a sense of the basic GUI functionality and how I loaded up the buildings. That's all the code is doing at the moment. And that gives you a sense of some GUI design. All I wanted to do was just make sure I could move the ship around, that I was able to populate the city, that I was able to gather some information about the city blocks, and be able to track some information about the game board itself. So that's all we need to really talk about right now. And then in the next one, we'll get into collision detection, which is really the core functionality of being able to detect where lasers are and make sure whether or not the ship caught them or not.